Good afternoon. My name is Matt Zemon. I am the author of Psychedelics for Everyone and also Beyond the Trip, which is a preparation and integration journal. On behalf of Wonderland, I have made those books free for download for today and tomorrow. So if you go onto Amazon, you can download those books for free just for coming to here. Well, thank you. So I went into my first mushroom journey with no real expectations. Some good friends suggested that I try a guided psilocybin experience, and I was so naive back then, I didn't even know what psilocybin was or why I would want to try that. In this first experience, I melted into the ground and connected with the earth in a way that I had never experienced before. I could feel the earth and the tree and the skies. In waves, I became aware of my parents and my grandparents and all the people I was connected to in the world. And I felt loved, unconditionally loved. And in that moment, I knew that every experience in my life was part of my learning and my healing and my growing and was perfect. And I realized I was safe, and I always would be. That first journey changed the way I look and interact with the world. We hear a lot about the medical use of psychedelics. We don't hear so much about regular people and the spiritual use of these medicines. Psychedelics can take us to a place where we come face to face with the true nature of our being, where fear is replaced by love, where isolation is replaced by unity, where ignorance is replaced by wisdom. The use of psychedelics for direct spiritual experience is nothing new. We know there's a cave painting of a mushroom shaman in Algeria, Africa, that's somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 years old. We know that the Greeks used psychedelics for a couple thousand years. We know that there are shamans in Siberia. We know that there are taitas in Central America and South America. We know that there were witches burned all over Europe for their use of psychedelics. And I bring this up to remind us that we all have a psychedelic lineage. The church and the state may have tried to repress it and suppress it, but it's there. And it's important for us to realize that it's there. So what's going on with our Western society? People are leaving churches in droves. The government is telling women what they can and can't do with their bodies. Huge numbers of adults and children are being prescribed antipsychotics and antidepressants and hypnotics and mood stabilizers with no plan to ever get them off. We've become a culture that excels in moral preaching and medical sedation, but we lack the understanding and the resources to explore individual consciousness. Historically, there were just healers. It was one role for medical and spiritual. And in our society, we have divided pure science for the doctors and pure spiritual for the clergy. It is fair when it comes to psychedelics to say, okay, well, these play in both realms, and if we just give psychedelics to the clergy, they don't have the latest knowledge about my brain and my body to keep us safe. That's fair. And conversely, doctors often lack knowledge with spiritual matters. And the result, which a lot of us have experienced, is a therapeutic process that can feel surprisingly superficial and unsure of its true aim and purpose. So when it comes to true healing, what is urgently needed is a reconciliation between the spiritual and the medical, enabling more people to transform their consciousness through direct experience. So today we are going to hear 4 panelists who each have a non-medical story of transformation that they are going to share. As you will see and hear, they come from a diverse set of backgrounds, and we're grateful for Microdose to create space for this type of conversation to happen. I'm hopeful that when you hear these stories, that you will resonate and connect with them and see that while we all may look different, we are just different waves in the same ocean. So I'm going to start with Spring Washam. Spring is a well-known meditation teacher and author and visionary leader now based in Atlanta, Georgia. She is the author of A Fierce Heart, Finding Strength, Courage, and Wisdom in Any Moment. And her newest book is The Spirit of Harriet Tubman, Awakening from the Underground. I could not put that book down. Can't recommend it highly enough. Spring is considered a pioneer in bringing mindfulness-based healing practices to diverse communities. She's a member of the Teachers Council of Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Northern California and has practiced and studied Buddhist philosophy both in the Theravada and Tibetan schools of Buddhism since 1999. In addition to being a teacher, she is a shamanic practitioner and has studied indigenous healing practices since 2008. She is the founder of Lotus Vine Journeys, an organization that blends indigenous healing practices with Buddhist wisdom in South America. Spring, can you please share what has brought you to this psychedelic journey and how that's impacted your life?
Yes, thank you. And it's nice to make space for these kind of spiritual stories, our stories of awakening in the midst of a conference where it's like, build your brand and how to, it's like, there is real transformation happening, and it's so good to have opportunities to share our personal stories. So thank you. We're a small but mighty group here. Also, so I want to just say that part of my story was that for many years before I got into working with plant-based medicine, my primary plant that I was working with is ayahuasca. And I had spent years doing meditation practice before I even got into that. I was really devoted to meditation, a path of awakening and insight meditation and studying and traveling all over Asia and really committed to that path a lot, the liberation path through meditation. But what happened after 10 years was that I wasn't really progressing like I thought I would. You know how we get into something initially, we're like, yeah, a year, I'll be stage 5 over, all my suffering. Well, 10 to 12 years in, I was like, I don't know if these deep patterns are really transforming. And so that led me into going to Peru and working with ayahuasca. And when I started working with the plant medicine and combining it with Buddhist wisdom, with my mindfulness, with my compassion practices, with my embodiment practices, it felt like a game changer. It was like, now we're driving. Before I was kind of crawling along. It felt like, now it's like, okay, we're in the car, we're in the express lane. This is good. I'm seeing some real momentum. And I think that that's really important, is that at that point I was also feeling very hopeless about my spiritual path. Like, I'm hitting all these walls, I'm hitting all these obstacles. What am I going to do? Maybe this doesn't even work. Does the Dharma work still? I had all these doubts, which is a part of it, But when I started working with the plant medicine and also working with psilocybin and ayahuasca, I started to feel this deeper devotion return, right? I started to be able to work with the deepest layers of my heart in a very different way. I was able to get down to some of these deeply painful programs, stories, trauma, and I feel like, I was lifting it. So that was really inspiring, and I ended up spending a year in the jungle with Shipibo healers, apprenticing at a temple, an ayahuasca temple. And then after that, I came back and I was like, okay, I'm going to start my own organization, because there was all these like stuck Buddhists being like, I'm not growing anymore. I plateaued. My heart is not opening. I read about this, but I don't feel it. We were all kind of like, are we faking it? There's a lot of fakery happening. We don't mean to do that. We want it to be real, but it's just not yet. Yeah, we just have to keep going, right? But how do you keep going? This is the key. So this was a little bit about my own journey. So what happened was I got back, and then that's when I started an organization to focus on people similar. Like, you're working with the moms. I was working with Buddhist practitioners stuck. So I had Zen priests.
Very specific.
Yeah, it was very specific. I had like Zen priests and all these like ex-clergy and all these people coming, and they were like, now I get it. We were having genuine insight. And so that has just been an evolution. And I'm just so grateful for this evolution and the insights and the spiritual growth that comes when you're really using these plants to liberate the mind. This wasn't for me entertainment. It was like I gotta heal my ancestors, and I got this much time. I'm ready to go. So that's a little bit of my transformational story. But I'm just so glad, and now I have an organization called Lotus Vine Journeys, where I work more broadly now with Buddhists, but also visionary change makers in Costa Rica. And so we utilize the same practices, meditation and Dharma teachings. And so anyway, all right. I don't want to go over my 5-minute allowance.
No, that's amazing. I have more questions for you, but I'm going to go around. We're going to talk to Tracey next, and we're going to come back to you, Spring. Thank you for sharing all that. So Tracey Tee is the founder of Moms on Mushrooms, which is an amazing organization offering both courses and a private community, and you have a march, I believe, you're planning for next year, and all sorts of things. And they bring mothers together worldwide through the sacred use of entheogenic medicine. They're doing work with education and with advocacy, and they're getting a ton of national attention, which is super exciting, super grateful to see what you're doing there. So Tracey, you had a rather late start with psychedelics. Tell us about what led you to psychedelics, and what is your relationship with them now?
Thank you. I did have a late start. I didn't have my first mushroom until I was 44 years old. So it was a shock to me how much and how quickly I fell in love with the medicine. And I've been thinking about like what led me to it, and I was listening to your story, and one thing that I kind of leave out when I say my journey was, and what I'm realizing as I sit here is that the mushrooms led me, which is very common with a lot of us. I felt like I was guided to a fateful camping trip with some other women where I had my first, handful of dried mushrooms, and I laid on a beach next to a lake, and I saw God, and I got it, and I left feeling more full than I ever did. And that sort of gave me permission to start microdosing, which really changed the trajectory of my life and my own spiritual journey almost instantly. And I still was holding back from really working with the medicine in a bigger way, because of my own programming and being fearful of it even still. And then my family, on a summer morning up in the mountains outside Aspen, Colorado at 10 a.m. got hit by a drunk driver in the mountains. And my 9-year-old daughter and my 18-year-old niece were in the car. And we got hit by someone going 70 miles an hour. We flew through a guardrail and flew 30 feet in the air and landed in a ditch. And then had to kick our way out of the car, pull the kids out, and it was horrible. And we were all fine, for the most part, not fine. We walked away from it, let me put it that way. And that big boom opened me up completely. And what I felt in real time, even just working with microdosing, was the grief and the terror and the trauma and the pain and the anger, all was leaving me as I felt it. It was like I was processing it out in real time, and I felt myself healing while I laid in bed waiting for my bruises to go away. That was boom number one. My daughter, rightfully so at 9 years old, had a hard time recovering. And this was only 2 years ago, and good luck finding a child therapist during our pandemic, so I couldn't get anyone to see my kid. And I ended up just asking people, anyone, do you know anyone who could see my daughter? The light is going out of her eyes. Long story short, our occupational therapist who was helping our injury said, well, I know this woman, and she's a shaman, and she's really hard to get a hold of. And I was like, say no more, give me your information. Stalked her for a month, begged her to see my daughter. Finally got in. My daughter, one session, left, no medicine or anything, obviously, left and fixed the accident. When it was my turn to finally get in to see her, I talked about this accident for about 20 minutes. Come to find out, this is a woman who's been serving medicine underground for decades. And that led my next path. And within a month of meeting her, I was on the floor with 3.5 grams of penis envy in me, talking to God and seeing my dharma, and my entire life changed because of that car accident. And so I very much feel that the mushrooms, for me, and the medicine has been guiding me along and then supporting me when I am being asked to face my greatest fears, my biggest tests, and to say yes and to surrender and to have compassion. And every step of the way, they're there to just open a door of lessons and then help push me through, and I just keep going. So that my transformational path, I don't think is ever gonna be over, but I feel that they absolutely have done it for me.
That's beautiful, and thank you for sharing that. That sounds like a really challenging experience to go through. Wesley Eugene, you are up next. All right, so my good friend Wesley here. Wesley is a strange bird. He is the Chief Information Officer of IDEO, which is a global organization, and you've worked with AFLAC and Capgemini. You are also the founding member of a entheogenic church in the South. I've heard you speak before about how psychedelics have helped you heal, helped you combat imposter syndrome, helped you alleviate anxiety. Tell us more. How did you get here, given your upbringing, given your career? How did you get here?
Yeah. Yep, it's on. Perfect. So my journey is an interesting one. I was working with an executive coach, and the reason why I was drawn to this particular coach is because he had a background in technology. He kind of got me, and let's face it, coming through the pandemic, I think all of us needed a little something more. Whatever our support systems were, whatever my support systems were, seemed to be coming up short, right? And so his name is Rob Kalrowski. He had me on a podcast. He also had you on a podcast. He eventually connected me with you, and you happened to be hanging out in Atlanta. We grabbed dinner, and ultimately that led me to a retreat. But my path to that retreat was actually a path where I was using SSRIs to manage my anxiety. What I experienced coming through the pandemic, March 2 of 2020 was my first day on the job at one of my previous companies, right? I had just moved to Chicago. I was super excited. And then in my role as then VP IT strategy and innovation, I had the responsibility within 2 weeks of shifting 20,000 folks from working in offices, managing medical information, to working remotely, and 14,000 of them were in India. I only mentioned that. That's another story for another time. It ended well, but it left me with a ton of stress. And that anxiety, that the stress triggered anxiety to the point that just email notifications, just the digital dings were like little triggers like, whoa, what's that? And so I asked my doctor to help me out with anxiety. He got me on Lexapro, which worked, but it had unintentional side effects that I did not like. And so when we met for dinner, I shared that with you. Fast forward, so I looked at psychedelics in two ways. One as a homeopathic alternative to traditional SSRIs, because I did not like the side effects. I also looked to it as something to help me with peak performance initially. And so ultimately, when I went on that first retreat, my experience was really impactful. I set an intention, basically, that I wanted to get to know why it was that I consistently put others ahead of myself, why it seemed that I somehow lacked the capability to love myself as much as I loved others. And it took me into a journey where I was confronted with my child self, who was sitting there in pain. It evoked so much emotion in me. I wanted to save that little kid so badly that I couldn't stop weeping. I just opened up and I was weeping and weeping. This is before any medicine, ironically. And then after the medicine, I went on this journey where I saw him again. I gave him a hug. When I gave him a hug, he disappeared into me. And I understood in that moment that to heal him then is to heal me now. To take care of him then is to take care of me now. And I received that. I saw my dad. I saw my mom. I understood different ways in which they loved me that I hadn't had the capacity to understand before. So it's really an impactful journey for me.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. I want to come back to you. That was beautiful. Henna Malik Bashak, you are next. I can see you down there a little bit. So you are only Muslim on the panel, and you have been open about your challenges with an ongoing dissociative disorder. Henna is so cool. She works for the Chacruna Institute of Psychedelic Plant Medicine and is on the board of directors with Students for Sensible Drug Policy, all while pursuing her master's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, studying psychoactive pharmaceuticals. That's a lot. So as a young person in the psychedelic space, Henna represents a generation that is increasingly interested in the potential of these substances for personal growth. And I'm so excited that you chose to join us today. I'd love you to talk about your experience being a Muslim who uses psychedelics openly, and also tell us a little bit about how psychedelics have helped you process your dissociative challenge.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so honored to be here with all of you guys, and I loved hearing all of your stories. And I really want to note one thing, that chronic stress is such a real thing, and I'm seeing it as a pattern with Wesley, Spring, and you, like being a mom, and I'm starting to realize that. So my story begins with disassociation and growing up as a Muslim. And for me, disassociation basically feels like you're detached from reality. You don't feel real. You're questioning your existence pretty much all the time. Actually, 75% of America has experienced disassociation at least once in their lifetime. And if you don't know what it feels like a really bad cannabis high, like all the time, or ketamine high all the time. So there's some context. But for me, it got really bad around COVID time. I was cooped up in the house. I was set to graduate with my associate's degree and my high school diploma. I was super excited to be on stage, walk across stage. I was excited to go to prom. I didn't have any of that. And I was working really hard at the time, and I didn't get to see any of my friends for months. It was really hard for me. So my disassociation got a lot worse. And after I graduated, I decided to go away to college. And I couldn't really drive. I couldn't go to work. I couldn't pay attention in school because I was disassociating all the time. It was just making everything bad for me. And in particular, it made my religious practice really hard for me because I felt very disconnected from God. I felt like I couldn't pray without disassociating. And in a way, this came into like, oh my gosh, am I disappointing God? Which is the worst feeling. I grew up Muslim. My parents are literally here right now. And like, they've been practicing in front of me since I was literally a baby. And so as a devoted Muslim, it was heartbreaking to me that I was going through that. I felt like, wow, this is like the last place I want to be in, disappointing God. And so I was super desperate to do anything to feel better. I went to therapy. I saw a psychiatrist in Florida. There's not the best healthcare. So within like 6 months, I was put on 5 different medications. And eventually I was put on 200 milligrams of Zoloft, which had terrible side effects to my body. I know how you feel about that, Wesley. It was terrible. So from there, I was like, okay, I need a different alternative. What do I do? But at the time, psychedelics and plant medicine didn't seem like an option to me because it was such a taboo in my culture. I grew up thinking like, oh, mushrooms are like heroin, or oh my gosh, like this is like not the right thing to do. It's like alcohol, and we're not allowed to do any of that in Islam. But after educating myself, I thought, maybe mushrooms is the way for me. So I ended up having my first macro dose of 3.7 grams. And it was not the best journey ever. It was not peaches and cream, as most of you guys know. Taking mushrooms doesn't always mean you're going to have a really good time. My disassociation was not cured. It still isn't cured. But it did allow me to become friends with my disassociation. I had to learn that it was a part of me, and this is who I am. And I also was really comforted by the idea of knowing that God isn't disappointed in me, that God understands what I'm going through. And from there on, every other journey that I've had with psychedelics, LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin, I've had that same repeating pattern that God is not disappointed in me and that I need to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm so sorry, Matt. I forgot the second question.
You think you're covering both beautifully. You're talking
Great,
about
thank you.
disassociation and you're talking about Islam. You're doing amazing job in it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so for my disassociation, how did psychedelics help me accept that? I basically knew that disassociation comes from PTSD or chronic stress, and I just couldn't figure out what was that traumatic event that sparked this. And I did ayahuasca very recently, and I found that intergenerational trauma is a very real thing, right? So my mom is here, like her grandma, and my grandma has passed down things to her, she's passed down things to me, unintentionally, very traumatizing things, right? Like on accident, that they were taught. And this just happens with different cultures. And so I learned that the trauma or like whatever disassociation I'm going through isn't just my trauma, it's my mom's trauma, it's my grandma's trauma, it's my ancestors' trauma. So the way that I need to deal with that is to treat myself well so that I can set an example for my ancestors. So that's what psychedelics has taught me so far. And I continue to explore ways on how I can research the intersection of both Islam and psychedelics eventually. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being so open about your journey with this. I think I have so many questions. So I'm gonna stick on this religious upbringing for a moment. I'm gonna start with Wesley, I'm gonna come over to you, Spring. But Wesley, you grew up, I know I didn't prep you for this, but you grew up in a really Christian household, like Christian X, right? A serious Christian household. How do you see, has psychedelics impacted your practice? Have you talked to your parents about psychedelics? Where does all this fit in?
Great question. So yeah, I grew up, I was raised Seventh-day Adventist. Somehow when my mom and dad were dating, my dad was Catholic. My mom, at the time her aunt was raising her Jehovah's Witness. They decided the compromise position was to become Seventh-day Adventist. Okay, and so I was raised in that faith tradition. Still have a lot of great friends in that faith tradition. For me, I had very complicated feelings around organized religion that really I began to confront as I went to college, like I suspect many others do. I remember saying a prayer. I said, before I went off to Florida, University of Florida, I said a prayer. I said, God, look, I'm emptying my cup. Whatever's supposed to be back in here, I trust you'll pour it back in. And whatever was never supposed to be in there, I pray will never come in. That was my simple prayer. And I went off to University of Florida, and hilarity ensues. But like ultimately, what I discovered with psychedelics was really interesting because what it did for me is that it was like a personal spiritual renaissance. I didn't really have imaginary friends as a kid. I tell the folks who know me very well, like, Jesus was my imaginary friend. Like, that was my homeboy. Like, I didn't have imaginary friends, right? I would just talk to Jesus. And so, and that didn't really end when I went on this journey away from organized religion, but it got quiet. It didn't end, but it got quiet. And it reawakened in a significant way in my journeys. I did not expect that. So I feel like the way to express it is I came to psychedelics, again, as a homeopathic alternative to SSRIs, but I stayed with it for the spiritual awakening, right? Yes, I stayed with it for the spiritual awakening, and words are a very cheap vehicle to communicate how important and transformative that's been in my life.
Thank you, my friend. Yeah. Spring, you're at this really interesting intersection between Buddhism and psychedelics. How do the teachings that you were studying for so many years, do they fit nicely in with the psychedelic plant experience, in your opinion? Did you have to cram it in? How do you feel these two things are married together?
Yeah, so now I think it's like, it reminds me a lot of this conference. We're merging everything now, whether it's coffee and adaptogens or gummies and ayahuasca, right? Or, like everything is being adapted. So first, that's just kind of where we are, I think, as a community. That's where we are in our culture. So I also came to the medicine similar. Like, I had all this unresolved trauma. SSRIs, I had never even considered it. I didn't even consider that was an option for me. So it was plant medicine, natural medicine. And then, of course, for me, what I was learning when I was deep in these very powerful ceremonies was, can I be present? Can I be compassionate? Here I am with my inner child. Her dad left, or she's abandoned. All the stories are there, right? And it's like, well, what is my response? Am I going to leave? Am I going to stay? How am I going to show up? So everything that I was learning intellectually in my spiritual walk was being deeply embodied in my heart, right? There's thinking about compassion as a nice idea, and then there's feeling your whole body filled with it in a moment where you need it the most. Because as we know, these ceremonies, they're not always rainbows, and it can be dark night, and that's just as important as the rainbow. Those are just as meaningful. So for me, they go really hand in hand. Every time I practice and I read something and I practice my meditation, in a way it prepares me for the ceremony. The future ceremony. Can I be more embodied? Can I be here? So for me, the path of wisdom and the spiritual path go hand in hand with these medicines. To take them out of context of any kind of spiritual awakening is, I think, detrimental. That's not how the indigenous people use them. That's not how, I think, history. This is about our awakening. This is about our collective humanity. This is about the earth. This is about so much more than what we might show up believing it's about, like performance. People enter into Buddhism like that too. How do I get more out of my life? And then they end up taking a meditation class, and then a year later they're on an island meditating alone. They first, donated all their things. There's those stories, right? So anyway, I'll stop there. But for me, they go very hand in hand. And I look forward to more religious communities, pastors, every walk of life to start thinking about merging their spiritual traditions. And let's look at religion and psychedelics in a different way. It's an inspiring topic for me.
Amazing, yes. Tracey, so we've mostly today been talking about kind of high dose, first dose, ceremonial dose, psychedelic experiences. You spend a lot of time in the world of microdosing, and I think you've developed a practice around microdosing that you share with other moms. Can you tell us about why microdosing, and where does microdosing fit into macrodosing in your world, and why would one choose one over the other?
Okay, my practice is simple, actually. It's just intention. And I don't think this word is coming back up a lot in our community, and I hope that it's escaping our little bubble and going out into the world. And I always talk about your why. What is your why? Why are you doing this? That's my practice, knowing my why. For me, microdosing, and this goes against my teachers, my mentors, I always say I'm like raised by medicine women because that's how I'm being taught with this medicine. I think that in our modern Western culture, the modern Western woman, the modern Western mother, has no context to understand what this medicine is supposed to do or could do. And I have a concern that many people, because we are also very much obsessed with this magic bullet, quick fix culture, that people will run to a large dose ceremony, whether it's psilocybin or ayahuasca or any number of things, and without context or a relationship, not only to the medicine, but to ceremony itself, it can be incredibly destabilizing. And then that person who isn't prepared for this transformational journey may walk away not being supported and then blame the medicine when it really is the intention and it's the practice. So my philosophy is, let's take it slow. We made it this long without the shrooms already, okay? Like we all made it here. And then let's just microdose and learn how it feels in your body. Learn your why. Learn what it feels like to peel back onion layers, to walk up to the edge of uncomfortability, to understand how you can have an ally that is from the Great Mother that can support you, and then learn how to work with it, not passively, which is also our culture, to just lay back, swallow a pill and let it do all the work. There's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. And I think the gentler way for the West to do it, at least for my little corner of the universe, for mothers, is to take your time and make it slow, and then go to that ceremony, which is absolutely so important. But go there with the understanding of why you're there and what this medicine can do for you. And so that's why I work with microdosing first for moms.
Thank you for that. We also, I think, forget that many people who are on antidepressants where other psychedelics might not be an option for them, psilocybin and ketamine are two options for the vast majority of people.
I think, I just had a conversation about this today earlier with a new friend, but I think slowing everything down in this space is going to be very helpful. I don't think rushing headfirst into any of these medicines is going to forward our movement. And so, and then inside that, there has to be grace with where you're at in your life. And SSRIs are a perfect example. We need to be gentle with either, holding space for someone who wants to go off them, and also be gentle if they're working. And inside that, you can still find a medicine that can support you, but it's not going to be a 2-week turnaround. You know, it's going to take years potentially. So I think, yeah, just slowing it down and being softer about all of it helps everybody.
Thank you. Hannah, so as a student in this space, and I do see some younger people here in the back, what advice do you have that you could give young people who are just starting out or trying to learn more, or maybe have just had a recreational experience or two?
Sure, yeah. I actually want to touch on something that Tracey just said about going slower. Indigenous leader Alton Krennic says that maybe the way to go faster is to go slower. And that's by, understanding where these medicines came from, setting intention, knowing your why, and I love that you said that. And I think that goes into one of my first advice for students is understanding the background of these medicines. Most of us will just hop into this and not pay respect and tribute to the indigenous leaders that brought us this medicine. So I know we have a lot of things going on with FDA regulation, and that's all amazing, but we really do need to take a step back and look at that. And as students and as young people, we need to understand that we're the next wave of researchers, scientists, psychiatrists. So how do we make sure our intention is pure? That way we could give our patients the best experience possible. Another thing I suggest for students is networking. I know when I first got into this space, I went to pretty much every single conference I could, whatever I could afford, which brings me to my next topic, scholarships. Most conferences will offer you scholarships. Another thing you can go look for is courses that offer scholarships, like Shakurna offers a few courses. There's one that we offer called the Science of Psychedelic Healing. There's one on shamanism and indigenous knowledge, which is a great 101 on getting into this industry. And another organization that I want to point out is SSDP, which is Students for Sensible Drug Policies. They teach about drug reform, harm reduction, and it's a really great place for students to start that have nowhere to go. So if you're in college, you can actually open a chapter up. And if you're interested in doing that, please reach out to me.
Thank you. I think it's important to understand kind of the way people access psychedelics in America. I mean, there's really 3 models. There's a medical model where people who want to have a diagnosis, have someone with a licensure greet them, have pharmaceutical grade medicine. The MDMA that's going to be legal next year, hopefully psilocybin a couple years after that. That's all the medical model, and it's important to have that model, and there's a whole bunch of things we can do in that world. Then there's the decriminalization model, and the decriminalization movement. The thesis is no adult should tell another adult that they can't put nature in their body. And originally as a non-drug user, I didn't really pay much attention to that. And I think that's important kind of as a libertarian position, but I also think it's hugely important from an access. The medical model is mostly not covered by insurance, which makes it expensive. And when decriminalization is paired with medical, it's opening up access for people who don't have the means. And then the third model is the religious freedom model. In a country founded on religious freedom, the government is not supposed to be interfering, and we have over 200 psychedelic churches and more coming, and hopefully some more paths for what's called a DEA exemption where we can practice. But all 3 spaces are ways that people meet the medicine, and all 3 spaces are opportunities to work with the medicine and build community, and they all can operate together. I want to allocate some time for audience questions, if there are some. And we can keep talking, but I wanted to make sure. Is there? Okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to go back then to spring. So you have this amazing book about your experience with Harriet Tubman. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what it's been like going through that process?
Yeah, I think that's like so many things, like Leslie, you were bringing up 2020 and all these different, that sort of felt like the crack in the foundation, right? The crack in our reality. There's been many, but that was like a big one, right? The tectonic plates were breaking open for either you in Chicago or Oakland, and That time I was in California, and there was like fires on top of that. I mean, literally. And it was during that time, right, in the summer of 2020, where I was doing an ayahuasca ceremony, and Harriet Tubman showed up full force. And I'd been praying for help for a month because I was just gutted from all of the destruction and the violence and the loss of everything. It was all floating down. All of us were in this. This was a shared experience of the whole world, and in many ways. So, and it was then I think I was trying to figure out how to be a leader, but I was in the fetal position, and everyone was knocking on the door like, help, like beeps and phones, and I was like, they were like, where is spring, and I'm like, hold on. And luckily, Harriet Tubman, the spirit of Harriet Tubman, started coming. And I write a whole book about this amazing connection with this ancestor, and I'm still trying to understand it. I'm still trying to make sense of it. I'm still feeling that. I'm still understanding that. But this whole book came out of our conversations. And the dialogue. And all I'll say is that Harriet Tubman is alive in a non-physical body. She doesn't have a body right now, but she's in consciousness. And it's a protector spirit and someone who is greatly invested in the liberation of all beings and is creating like this medicine, these underground railroads, these paths against the laws. And, we're up against, all kinds of things, right? And we're going. And this, I feel like for my life right now, Harriet Tubman is like my chief maestra. She's a guide, and I evoke that on my journeys when I'm getting ready with people, as I'm a plant medicine guide. And so I evoke that, like, Harriet, we're leaving it to you. Get us to the promised land. So I have this deep connection. So in addition to Buddhism, Harriet Tubman, plant medicine, you start collecting things here, which is good. These are helpful. These gives you a kind of power that you need to, lead this work and be on the front line of it in many, many ways, literally. So thank you.
Thank you. Wesley, a lot of people who say they're coming into psychedelics for kind of human optimization, they might do one ceremony, maybe they do another. You have chosen to come multiple times. Where are you going with this? What do you see as your journey with psychedelics? How does it impact you? And why do you come back? Why would anyone come back more than once?
Yeah, that's a great question. So anyone who's gone on one of these journeys, one of the things you need to make peace with is that you're going to get homework. Oftentimes, it's a lot of homework. Right? And so when we talk about integration, that's a very nice kind of softer term to say something we don't want to talk about, which is homework. And that work. So what brings me back is as doors are unlocked, as I'm learning more about myself, as I'm doing more of the homework, as more of the integration. New questions come up. And so that's part of it. But another part of it, just to keep it 100%, is communion. Again, words are a very cheap vehicle to describe some of these things, but if someone told you, here's an opportunity where you can shut out all the noise of the world and you could be at one with Source, with the Creator, with the universe, or however you experience your spirituality, wouldn't you probably say yes to that? And so for me, it's been a calling and an opportunity to dig back into that. I guess the one thing the final thing I'll share is, out of that initial journey of trying to figure out wrestle with my seemingly incapacity to love myself as fully as I love others, I was given a gift. I walked out of there with what I now call my love OS, my love operating system. And it's two principles. One is make all your decisions based on love. The second one is say yes to anything that doesn't violate the first principle. And the first principle has a hierarchy. It says love yourself. The second tier is love your family and your friends. The third is love your team. And the fourth is love your community. And so that hierarchy is something that actually I implement as a decision-making framework. And when something doesn't violate that, then I say yes to everything else because I realize I've opted out of so much joy. But ironically in life, you don't get to opt out of pain. It comes anyway. So if you're opting out of joy, you're literally telling the creator, the universe, in my experience, no, I'm not going to have any of that, but give me more of the pain. And, who wants that? So.
Yeah, suffering is optional. Hannah, non-scripted question, but you were recently married and you are a daughter. How have psychedelics changed your relationships?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So with my disassociation, I felt like when we were engaged, I felt like I was less of like I wasn't a good fiance. Maybe I was like not attentive because I felt like my disassociation was taking me away from the present moment, enjoying my time with Seiran. And with my parents as well, I found before I got off my medications were turning me into this really angry person. You had these really bad symptoms. My parents saw like the light go out of my eyes. I just wasn't a happy person. And so when I started doing psychedelics, I started feeling like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing these things. Like I'm actually realizing that I'm not being the best fiance, I'm not being the best daughter, I'm not being the best, partner. And I think in my way of like connecting with God through psychedelics, I've become a better daughter, become a better partner, because me and my fiance husband now, sorry, shoot, we pray together like pretty much whenever we can, and I think that's a beautiful thing, and it reminds me of community, kind of like what Wesley said, because I think when you go into a psychedelic journey, a lot of people these days are really focused on only themselves. And I think, yes, like you need to do your individual healing, but also figure out how your healing is going to benefit your community as in your family, your team, your work. Anybody in your life is your community. And that's what I started taking in. I learned that from the Chakra Institute. I learned that, your psychedelics should impact your community. And your psychedelic use, sorry. So that's kind of how I feel like psychedelics have impacted me with my family. And I think during my ayahuasca ceremony, when I was realizing that there was a lot of intergenerational trauma, it wasn't just from like my mom's side, it was on my dad's side. And I remember there was this one night, it was the second night of the ceremony, and it was completely dark. I usually hate journaling because I do this thing where I'll write the first word, hate how my handwriting looks, and I'll take the page out and I'll rip it, and by then I wasted like a freaking tree. So it was completely dark, and I could not see what I was writing, but from that moment, I just felt like I was channeling like trauma from my dad and my mom, and just writing everything out, and I was like, oh my gosh, like they've been through a lot. I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. Why am I not being more empathetic about this? And so that's where the intergenerational trauma came in, and I understood that there's a lot of healing that needs to be done there. But I also want to acknowledge that God was telling me that it isn't only my job to deal with the intergenerational trauma. So I don't want to have that burden, I'm still my own person. So that's kind of what psychedelics have taught me.
That's a beautiful place to end on this. That is amazing. Thank you. So I want to end with just a quick parting thought. The founders of our country stated in the First Amendment that legislation should refrain from restricting religious practice. And does it not seem reasonable for adults like those on the panel today who decide to undertake these potentially transformative spiritual journeys that they should be able to do so openly under the best scientific, psychological, and religious wisdom? Let it be so. Thank you for attending tonight's panel. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Microdose team. Enjoy the rest of the Wonderland experience.
And thank you, panel.